Picture this. You're walking through the cobblestone streets of medieval Palermo, Sicily. The year is 1478. The Mediterranean sun beats down on weathered stone walls, and the scent of salt air mingles with the perfume of orange blossoms drifting from hidden courtyards. Bells chime from a dozen churches, their bronze voices echoing off ancient palaces built by Arabs, Normans, and Byzantines who once ruled this crossroads of empires. But beneath this picture of devotion and beauty, something dark is stirring within the walls of the convent of Santa Chiara. You wouldn't notice it at first. The nuns go about their daily routines with the same measured pace that has governed monastic life for centuries. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The hours structured around prayer, work, and contemplation. But if you looked closer, if you listened more carefully to the whispers that drift through the corridors like incense smoke, you might catch wind of something unsettling, something that would make your blood run cold and your faith tremble. Because within those sacred walls, Sister Margarita da Palermo has begun to hunger for something no bride of Christ should ever crave. Human flesh. And not just any flesh, the tender, unblemished meat of children. The story you're about to hear isn't just about madness or cannibalism. It's about how evil can disguise itself in the robes of holiness, how corruption can fester in the heart of purity, and how an entire community can become complicit in the unthinkable. This is the tale of the Cannibal Nun of Palermo, a woman whose name became synonymous with horror across medieval Europe. But like all the darkest stories, this one begins not with screams or blood, but with silence. The terrible, suffocating silence of secrets buried too deep to surface until they finally claw their way into the light. Sicily, in the 15th century, was a powder keg of political tensions, religious fervor, and social upheaval. The island had been passed between rulers like a prize in a deadly game of chess. Muslim emirs, Norman knights, Holy Roman emperors, and now the crown of Aragon all had left their mark on the landscape and the people. In this crucible of cultures, Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a weapon, a shield, and a desperate grasp for order in chaos. The Spanish Inquisition was gaining momentum, and Sicily became one of its most brutal theaters. Jews and Muslims who had lived peacefully alongside Christians for centuries suddenly found themselves targets of suspicion and violence. Conversos, those who had converted to Christianity, were watched with particular intensity. Any slip in their new faith, any whisper of their old practices, could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. The very air seemed to crackle with paranoia and religious extremism. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped men like Tomás de Torquemada, whose name would become synonymous with inquisitorial brutality. Though he never set foot in Sicily, his influence stretched across the Mediterranean like a dark shadow. Local inquisitors, eager to prove their zeal, began hunting heretics with the fervor of men possessed. Confessions were extracted through torture. Families were torn apart by accusations. Entire neighborhoods lived in terror of the midnight knock on the door. But it wasn't just the Inquisition that created this atmosphere of fear and fanaticism. The Church itself was undergoing its own internal crisis. The Renaissance had brought new ideas about humanity, art, and knowledge that seemed to challenge traditional religious authority. Humanist scholars were rediscovering classical texts that painted a picture of human potential that seemed at odds with Christian teachings about sin and redemption. The printing press was spreading these dangerous ideas faster than the Church could contain them. In response, many within the Church doubled down on the most extreme interpretations of Christian doctrine. Self-flagellation became not just acceptable, but encouraged. Mystical experiences were sought through ever more extreme forms of asceticism. The line between holy ecstasy and madness became increasingly blurred. It was in this context that convents like Santa Chiara became pressure cookers of religious intensity, where the pursuit of spiritual perfection could transform into something much darker. The convent of Santa Chiara had been established in 1253 by followers of Saint Clare of Assisi, the female counterpart to Saint Francis. It was meant to be a place of peace, contemplation, and service to God. The poor Clares, as they were known, had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that were supposed to free them from worldly concerns and allow them to focus entirely on their spiritual development. But like many religious institutions of the time, Santa Chiara had become something far removed from its founder's vision. By the time Sister Margarita arrived at the convent in 1465, the institution had evolved into a complex social organism that reflected all the tensions and contradictions of the broader society. Many of the nuns came from wealthy families who had essentially bought their daughters places in the convent, not out of religious calling but as a form of social disposal. Younger daughters who couldn't be married off advantageously, women who had been compromised in some way, or simply those who had shown too much independence were packed off to religious life, whether they wanted it or not. The result was a community filled with women who had never chosen their vocation, who struggled with the restrictions of monastic life, and who often brought with them all the petty jealousies, ambitions, and resentments of the outside world. Add to this the intense religious pressure of the time, the constant emphasis on sin and redemption, and the isolation from normal human contact, and you have a recipe for psychological breakdown. Sister Margarita de Palermo was born Elena Ruggeri in 1442 to a family of minor nobility whose fortunes had been devastated by the political upheavals of the era. Her father had backed the wrong side in a succession dispute and found himself stripped of his lands and titles. Her mother, unable to cope with the shame and financial ruin, had retreated into a kind of religious mania that would prove to be an ominous foreshadowing of her daughter's fate. Elena was described by those who knew her as a child of unusual intelligence and intensity. She learned to read at an early age, devouring religious texts with a hunger that impressed her tutors. But there was something unsettling about her devotion even then. She would fast for days at a time, flagellate herself until she bled, and spend hours in prayer positions that left her unconscious from exhaustion. Her parents, already struggling with their own problems, saw her religious fervor as a blessing. At least one of their children was destined for holiness. When Elena was 23, her parents made the decision that would seal her fate. Unable to provide her with a dowry for marriage and unwilling to support her indefinitely, they arranged for her to enter the convent of Santa Chiara. She took the name Sister Margarita and seemed to embrace her new life with the same intensity that had marked her childhood devotions. The other nuns initially admired her dedication. She prayed longer, fasted more severely, and subjected herself to penances that made even the most ascetic among them uncomfortable. But what they interpreted as holiness was actually the beginning of a descent into something far darker. Sister Margarita's fasting wasn't just about spiritual discipline, it was becoming an obsession with hunger itself, a fascination with the sensations of starvation that would eventually transform into something much more sinister. Her prayers weren't expressions of love for God, but desperate attempts to quiet voices that had begun whispering in her head, and her self-flagellation wasn't penance but a form of pleasure that she was beginning to crave with increasing intensity. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during the winter of 1470. Sister Margarita had been assigned to care for the convent's small infirmary, where sick nuns were tended and where the occasional visitor might receive medical attention. It was considered an honor, a recognition of her supposed spiritual maturity and compassion. But for Sister Margarita, it became something else entirely. It became a hunting ground. The infirmary was located in the oldest part of the convent, in rooms that had been carved out of the foundations of an even older building. The walls were thick stone that muffled sound, and the narrow windows let in only thin slivers of light. It was here, in this isolated and shadowy space, that Sister Margarita began to give in to urges that had been building for years. The first victim was Sister Caterina, a young nun who had fallen ill with a fever that refused to break. She was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, completely dependent on Sister Margarita's care. It was during one of these periods of delirium that Sister Margarita first tasted human flesh. She would later claim that she had been driven by divine visions, that God himself had commanded her to partake of the sacred flesh of the pure. But those who survived to tell the tale spoke of something far more disturbing. They described how Sister Margarita's eyes would change when she looked at a patient, how her breathing would become shallow and rapid, how her hands would tremble as she prepared medicines or changed bandages. They spoke of finding small wounds on patients that couldn't be explained by their illnesses, wounds that looked suspiciously like bite marks. And they whispered about the strange satisfaction that seemed to emanate from Sister Margarita after she had spent time alone with the sickest patients. Sister Caterina died after 3 weeks in the infirmary, her body wasted away to almost nothing. Sister Margarita claimed that she had fasted herself to death out of holy devotion, that she had achieved a state of spiritual purification that had allowed her soul to ascend directly to heaven. But the other nuns who prepared the body for burial noticed something disturbing. There were pieces missing. Small sections of flesh from her arms and legs had been carefully cut away, so skillfully that they might have been dismissed as part of the normal decomposition process. Might have been, if not for the fact that the wounds were too clean, too deliberate, too surgical. The abbess, Mother Francesca, was faced with a terrible dilemma. To acknowledge what she suspected would mean admitting that her convent housed a monster, that she had failed in her most basic duty to protect those under her care. It would mean investigation, scandal, and the probable dissolution of Santa Chiara. The nuns would be scattered to other convents, their families would be disgraced, and Mother Francesca herself would face charges of negligence or worse, so she chose silence. She chose to believe Sister Margarita's explanations, to accept her claims of divine visions and holy purpose. She chose to look the other way when more nuns began to fall ill in the infirmary, when the mortality rate among patients began to climb to levels that couldn't be explained by natural causes. She chose complicity over conscience, and in doing so she became as guilty as the woman she was protecting. The pattern continued for months. Young nuns would fall ill with mysterious ailments. They would be taken to the infirmary under Sister Margarita's care. They would seem to recover for a time, only to suffer relapses that left them weaker and more vulnerable. And then they would die, their bodies mysteriously diminished, their flesh bearing the subtle signs of unnatural wounds. Sister Margarita's appetite grew with each victim. What had begun as small, furtive tastes became more substantial meals. She developed techniques for keeping her victims alive but helpless, using combinations of herbs and mild poisons that would induce weakness without causing immediate death. She learned to cut away flesh in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious, taking pieces from areas that would be covered by burial shrouds or that could be explained as bed sores or other natural deterioration. But it wasn't just the physical act of cannibalism that drove her. Sister Margarita had begun to develop an elaborate theological justification for her actions. She claimed that she was following the example of Christ, who had commanded his followers to eat his flesh and drink his blood. She argued that by consuming the flesh of the pure and holy, she was incorporating their spiritual essence into her own being, becoming more perfect with each act of consumption. She spoke of visions in which Christ himself appeared to her, not as the gentle shepherd of popular imagination, but as a figure of terrible hunger and consuming fire. In these visions, she claimed, Christ revealed to her that the traditional forms of communion were mere symbols, that true spiritual communion required the literal consumption of sacred flesh. The bread and wine of the Mass were inadequate substitutes for the real thing, the actual body and blood of the faithful. These theological rationalizations weren't just private delusions. Sister Margarita began to share them with select members of the convent community, those she judged to be spiritually advanced enough to understand the truth she claimed to have discovered. She held secret meetings in the depths of the convent, in chambers that had been abandoned since the building's construction. There, by candlelight, she would preach her heretical doctrine to a growing circle of followers. The women who joined her weren't simply gullible or weak-minded. They were products of the same religious extremism that had shaped Sister Margarita herself. They were desperate for spiritual significance, for a form of religious experience that would validate their sufferings and give meaning to their isolation. Sister Margarita offered them something no conventional religious practice could: the promise of literal transformation, of becoming something more than human through the consumption of sacred flesh. The rituals that developed around these gatherings were grotesque parodies of Christian worship. Sister Margarita would bring portions of flesh from her latest victim, carefully prepared and presented as if it were the communion wafer. The participants would consume these offerings while reciting prayers that mixed traditional Christian language with blasphemous innovations. They would speak of tasting the divine, of feeling the spiritual essence of the consumed flowing through their own bodies. But even among this twisted congregation, there were those who began to have doubts. Sister Agnès, who had been among the first to join Sister Margarita's inner circle, began to notice inconsistencies in the doctrine she was being taught. If they were truly consuming the flesh of the holy, why did it sometimes taste of fear and pain? If this was divine communion, why did she feel increasingly hollow and desperate rather than filled with spiritual light? Her questions were met with increasingly violent responses from Sister Margarita, who had begun to show signs of the psychological deterioration that her cannibalism had accelerated. She would fly into rages when challenged, claiming that doubt was a form of spiritual weakness that proved the questioner was unworthy of the sacred knowledge she was sharing. She began to speak of the need for greater purity among her followers, of the necessity of consuming not just the flesh of the sick and dying, but of the young and innocent. It was this escalation that finally broke the conspiracy of silence that had protected her for so long. Sister Margarita's hunger had grown beyond what the convent's natural mortality rate could satisfy. She needed fresh victims, younger victims, victims whose spiritual purity was unquestionable. And so she began to look beyond the walls of Santa Chiara to the children of Palermo, who would sometimes visit the convent with their families or who might be brought there for religious instruction. The first child to disappear was Marco, the 8-year-old son of a baker who had been delivering bread to the convent. He was last seen entering the gates of Santa Chiara on a warm spring morning in 1478. When his father came looking for him that evening, he was told that the boy had never arrived, that there must be some mistake. But Marco's body was never found, and the baker's increasingly frantic searches yielded no trace of his son. Within a week, 2 more children had vanished. Both had been seen in the vicinity of the convent. Both had connections to the religious community, and both had simply disappeared as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The people of Palermo, already on edge from the activities of the Inquisition and the general climate of fear and suspicion, began to whisper about supernatural explanations. Some spoke of demons that had taken residence in the convent. Others suggested that the children had been victims of ritual murder by secret Jews or Muslims. But there were a few who suspected something closer to the truth. Giuseppe Ruggeri, a physician who had occasionally treated the nuns at Santa Chiara, had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the deaths at the convent. Too many young, healthy women were dying of mysterious wasting diseases. Too many bodies showed signs of unexplained wounds. And there were the reports from servants and delivery people who spoke of strange sounds coming from the depths of the convent, of screams that seemed to echo from underground chambers. Dr. Ruggeri was a man of science and reason, not given to superstition or wild theories. But he was also a man with a conscience who couldn't ignore the evidence that was accumulating before him. He began to keep detailed records of the deaths at Santa Chiara, noting patterns and anomalies that might have been dismissed individually, but that formed a disturbing picture when viewed together. His investigation led him to a terrible conclusion. Someone within the convent was murdering the nuns, and the deaths were not random, but followed a pattern that suggested a predator operating with methodical precision. The victims were always young, always healthy before their mysterious illnesses began, and always isolated in the infirmary under the care of the same person, Sister Margarita da Palermo. But even Dr. Ruggeri couldn't have imagined the full scope of the horror that was unfolding within the convent walls. He thought he was dealing with a simple case of murder, terrible but comprehensible. He had no idea that he was confronting something far more disturbing, a descent into cannibalistic madness that had infected not just one disturbed individual, but an entire community of religious women. The truth began to emerge in the most unexpected way. Sister Agnese, who had been struggling with doubt and horror at what she had participated in, finally reached a breaking point. She had been present when Sister Margarita had brought the flesh of young Marco to one of their secret gatherings, had watched as the woman she had once revered as a holy mystic had carved pieces from a child's body with the same reverence others might reserve for consecrating the communion wafer. The sight had shattered something fundamental in Sister Agnese's mind. She realized that she had been living in a nightmare, that the spiritual transformation she had sought had instead led her into the deepest pits of hell. That night, she made a decision that would bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. She would confess everything to the authorities, regardless of the consequences to herself. But Sister Margarita had been watching her followers carefully, alert to any signs of weakness or betrayal. She had noticed Sister Agnese's increasing withdrawal from the group, her reluctance to participate in their rituals, her obvious horror at the escalation of their activities. And she had decided that Sister Agnese represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The confrontation came in the depths of the convent, in the same chambers where Sister Margarita had been conducting her blasphemous rituals. She lured Sister Agnese there under the pretense of a private spiritual consultation, claiming that she had received a vision that would help resolve the younger nun's doubts. But when Sister Agnese arrived, she found herself face to face, not with a spiritual guide, but with a predator who had finally dropped all pretense of holiness. Sister Margarita attacked with the fury of a wild animal, her hands clawing at Sister Agnese's face and throat. But years of malnutrition and the psychological toll of her cannibalistic practices had weakened her, and Sister Agnese, younger and desperate, managed to fight her off. In the struggle, Sister Margarita's robes were torn open, revealing the extent of the physical deterioration that her practices had caused. Her body was covered in self-inflicted wounds, her flesh bearing the marks of the same teeth that had consumed so many others. Sister Agnese fled from the chamber, her screams echoing through the convent corridors, but instead of running to the authorities as she had planned, she found herself confronting Mother Francesca, the abbess who had chosen silence over justice for so long, and in that confrontation the full extent of the conspiracy was finally revealed. Mother Francesca had known. She had known about the deaths, about the disappearances, about the horrific rituals that had been taking place in the depths of her convent. She had known, and she had chosen to protect the institution over the lives of those who were being sacrificed to Sister Margarita's madness. She had been complicit not just through inaction but through active participation in the cover-up. The abbess tried to silence Sister Agnès with threats and bribes, but the young nun had moved beyond fear. She had seen too much, participated in too much to be silenced now. She demanded that Mother Francesca summon the authorities immediately, that Sister Margarita be arrested and the truth be revealed. When the abbess refused, Sister Agnese made a decision that would change everything. She walked out of the convent of Santa Chiara and went directly to the palace of the Inquisition. In a voice that shook with horror and remorse, she confessed not just Sister Margarita's crimes, but her own participation in them. She described the cannibalistic rituals, the murders, the disappearances of the children. She provided details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes could have known. And she begged for the chance to make amends for her sins by helping to bring the true perpetrator to justice. The inquisitors who heard her confession were initially skeptical. The accusations were so extreme, so bizarre, that they seemed more like the ravings of a madwoman than a credible testimony. But Sister Agnes's detailed knowledge of the crimes and her willingness to implicate herself in them gave her story a credibility that couldn't be dismissed. An investigation was ordered, and within hours, a team of officials was dispatched to the convent of Santa Chiara. What they found there exceeded even their worst expectations. In the underground chambers that Sister Margarita had used for her rituals, they discovered evidence of systematic murder and cannibalism that stretched back years. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in blasphemous parodies of religious symbols. Preserved organs stored in jars like religious relics, and detailed records that Sister Margarita had kept of her victims, describing their spiritual qualities and the effects of consuming their flesh. The investigation revealed that at least 23 nuns had died under suspicious circumstances during Sister Margarita's tenure at the convent. The 3 missing children were found buried in the convent's garden, their bodies showing clear evidence of the fate that had befallen them. And in Sister Margarita's cell, investigators found the most disturbing evidence of all: a journal in which she had recorded her theological justifications for her crimes, her visions of Christ commanding her to consume human flesh, and her plans for expanding her cannibalistic practices to include the entire population of Palermo. The trial of Sister Margarita da Palermo began in the autumn of 1478 and became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in the history of the Inquisition. The courtroom was packed with spectators who came to hear the details of crimes that seemed to belong more to nightmare than reality. The prosecution presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic murder and cannibalism carried out under the guise of religious devotion. Sister Margarita's defense was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. She showed no remorse for her actions, instead claiming that she had been following divine commandments that superseded human law. She insisted that her visions were genuine, that Christ had appeared to her and commanded her to consume the flesh of the pure as a form of spiritual communion. She spoke of the transformation she had undergone through her cannibalistic practices, claiming that she had achieved a state of spiritual perfection that placed her beyond ordinary moral constraints. The theological implications of her defense created a crisis for the Church. If Sister Margarita's visions were genuine, then the Catholic doctrine of communion was fundamentally flawed. If they were false, then the Church had to explain how one of its most devout members could have fallen so completely into delusion and evil. Either way, the trial represented a challenge to religious authority that couldn't be easily dismissed. The testimony of Sister Agnese and the other surviving members of Sister Margarita's inner circle provided the most damning evidence against her. They described the rituals in horrific detail, the gradual escalation from consuming small portions of flesh to full-scale cannibalism, the theological justifications that had allowed them to participate in acts that violated every principle of Christian morality. Their testimony revealed not just the extent of Sister Margarita's crimes, but the way in which religious extremism could be twisted into a justification for the most heinous acts. The defense attempted to argue that Sister Margarita was insane, that her crimes were the result of mental illness rather than genuine evil. They brought in physicians who testified about the effects of extreme fasting and self-flagellation on the human mind, arguing that years of religious extremism had driven her beyond the bounds of reason. But this defense was ultimately unsuccessful, both because of the methodical nature of her crimes and because the Inquisition was reluctant to accept insanity as an excuse for heresy. The verdict was never in doubt. Sister Margarita da Palermo was found guilty of murder, cannibalism, heresy, and corruption of religious doctrine. The sentence was death, to be carried out in the most public and painful manner possible. But even in the face of execution, she showed no remorse for her actions. Instead, she used her final statements to preach her twisted theology, claiming that her death would be a martyrdom that would inspire others to follow her example. The execution took place on November 15th, 1478, in the main square of Palermo. Thousands of spectators gathered to witness the death of the woman who had become known throughout Europe as the Cannibal Nun. She was burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for heresy, but not before being subjected to additional tortures designed to extract a final confession or expression of remorse. Even as the flames consumed her, Sister Margarita continued to preach her heretical doctrine. Witnesses reported that she spoke of visions of Christ welcoming her into heaven, of the spiritual transformation that awaited those who followed her example. Her voice could be heard above the roar of the fire, proclaiming that her death was not an ending but a beginning, that others would continue the work she had started. The execution of Sister Margarita should have been the end of the story, but in many ways it was just the beginning. The scandal of the Cannibal Nun sent shockwaves through the Catholic Church and led to a complete reformation of monastic life across Europe. Convents were subjected to much stricter oversight, with regular inspections and mandatory reporting of deaths or disappearances. The isolation that had allowed Sister Margarita's crimes to continue for so long was replaced by a system of accountability that made such horrors much more difficult to hide. But the impact of the case extended far beyond administrative reforms. The story of Sister Margarita da Palermo became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism, a reminder that the pursuit of holiness could be twisted into justification for the most unholy acts. Her case was cited by Protestant reformers as evidence of the corruption inherent in Catholic monasticism, while Catholic authorities used it to argue for stricter control over religious communities. The psychological aspects of her case also had lasting impact. The detailed records of her mental deterioration, preserved in the Inquisition archives, provided some of the earliest systematic documentation of what would later be recognized as psychotic behavior. Her combination of religious delusions, cannibalistic compulsions, and charismatic leadership became a template for understanding how individual madness could infect entire communities. The other nuns who had participated in Sister Margarita's rituals faced various fates. Some, like Sister Agnese, were granted clemency in exchange for their cooperation with the investigation. Others were sentenced to life imprisonment in isolated convents where they could do no further harm. A few, those who had been most deeply involved in the cannibalistic practices, were executed alongside their leader. Mother Francesca, the abbess who had enabled Sister Margarita's crimes through her silence, was stripped of her position and sentenced to spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. The convent of Santa Chiara was dissolved, its buildings eventually converted to secular use. The site became a reminder of the horror that had unfolded there, a place that even the most devout would avoid. The families of the victims struggled to come to terms with the revelation that their loved ones had been murdered and consumed by those who were supposed to protect them. The parents of the missing children were granted the small comfort of knowing their fate, but the knowledge that their sons had been victims of cannibalistic rituals made their grief even more unbearable. Compensation was paid by the church, but no amount of money could restore what had been lost. The story of Sister Margarita da Palermo spread rapidly throughout Europe, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and traveling scholars. It became the subject of sermons and moral treatises, a cautionary tale used to warn against the dangers of religious extremism. But it also became the stuff of legend and nightmare, inspiring stories and ballads that would be told for generations. In the years following her execution, reports began to surface of other similar cases in convents across Europe. It's unclear whether these were genuine cases of cannibalistic nuns or whether the notoriety of Sister Margarita's case had created a kind of moral panic that led to false accusations. But the pattern was disturbing enough that the Catholic Church instituted new procedures for investigating suspicious deaths in religious communities. The case also had a profound impact on the development of criminal law. The detailed investigation of Sister Margarita's crimes and the careful documentation of the evidence became a model for future criminal prosecutions. The psychological insights gained from studying her case influenced the development of legal concepts of insanity and diminished capacity that would become important in later centuries. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case was its effect on public perception of religious authority. The revelation that a trusted religious figure could commit such horrible crimes while maintaining the appearance of holiness shattered many people's faith in the institutional church. It contributed to the growing skepticism that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation and the broader questioning of religious authority that characterized the Renaissance. The story of Sister Margarita da Palermo serves as a reminder that evil can wear many faces, that the most dangerous monsters are often those who disguise themselves as angels of light. Her case demonstrates how isolation, extremism, and unchecked authority can create conditions in which the most horrific crimes can flourish. It shows how a community's desire to protect its reputation can lead to complicity in the very evils it claims to oppose. But it also demonstrates the power of conscience and courage in the face of evil. Sister Agnes's decision to break her silence and reveal the truth, despite the personal cost, ultimately brought an end to the horror and prevented further victims. Her example reminds us that even those who have been complicit in evil can find the strength to do what is right, that redemption is possible even for those who have fallen into the deepest darkness. The archives of the Inquisition still contain the complete records of Sister Margarita's trial, including her own writings and the testimony of those who survived her reign of terror. These documents provide a chilling glimpse into the mind of a woman who had convinced herself that the most heinous acts were expressions of divine will. They show how religious language and imagery can be twisted to justify the unjustifiable, how the pursuit of spiritual perfection can become a form of madness. Today, visitors to Palermo can still see the site where the convent of Santa Chiara once stood. The buildings have long since been demolished, replaced by modern structures that give no hint of the horror that once unfolded there. But the memory persists, preserved in the historical records and in the stories that are still told by those who remember the lessons of the past. The case of Sister Margarita da Palermo reminds us that the capacity for evil exists in all human hearts, that the difference between saint and sinner can be as thin as the line between devotion and obsession. It warns us about the dangers of unquestioned authority, of communities that value reputation over truth, of individuals who convince themselves that they are above the moral laws that govern the rest of humanity. But it also reminds us of the power of truth to triumph over deception, of justice to prevail over injustice, of the human conscience to assert itself even in the face of overwhelming pressure to remain silent. The story of the Cannibal Nun of Palermo is ultimately not just a tale of horror, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the eventual triumph of good over evil. In the end, Sister Margarita da Palermo achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind she had sought. She is remembered not as a saint or a mystic, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the pursuit of holiness becomes corrupted by pride, madness, and the fundamental human capacity for evil. Her story continues to be told not because we admire her, but because we need to remember the lessons she taught us about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most sacred institutions. The bells of Palermo still ring out across the ancient city, calling the faithful to prayer, just as they did in Sister Margarita's time. But they ring now over a community that has learned to be more vigilant, more questioning, more aware of the potential for evil that exists even in the most holy places. The story of the Cannibal Nun serves as their eternal reminder that the price of goodness is eternal vigilance, that the light of truth must always be ready to pierce the darkness of deception, and that the courage to speak truth to power is the most sacred duty of all. The convent of Santa Chiara is gone, its stones scattered and its memory deliberately erased by church authorities who wanted to forget the horror that had unfolded within its walls. But the story refuses to die, passed down through generations like a virus that infects the collective memory of a community that witnessed the unthinkable. In the decades that followed Sister Margarita's execution, scholars and theologians would dissect her case, trying to understand how a woman who had once been praised for her devotion could have descended into such depths of depravity. They found their answers not in demonic possession or supernatural evil, but in the very human capacity for self-deception and the dangerous power of unchecked religious authority. The psychological profile that emerged from their studies was disturbing in its familiarity. Sister Margarita had displayed all the classic signs of what would later be recognized as narcissistic personality disorder combined with religious psychosis. Her grandiose sense of spiritual superiority, her inability to feel empathy for her victims, her skill at manipulating others through religious language and imagery, all pointed to a personality that had been warped by years of isolation and extreme religious practices. But she was not simply a madwoman operating in isolation. Her crimes had been enabled by a system that valued institutional reputation over individual lives, that prioritized obedience over conscience, that created conditions in which the most vulnerable members of society could be victimized without consequence. The convent of Santa Chiara had become a perfect predator habitat, a place where someone with Sister Margarita's psychological profile could operate with impunity for years. The investigation revealed that warning signs had been ignored, that concerns had been dismissed, that obvious patterns of suspicious behavior had been rationalized away by those who should have been protecting the innocent. Mother Francesca's complicity was not just passive, but active, involving the deliberate suppression of evidence and the intimidation of potential witnesses. The entire power structure of the convent had been corrupted by the need to maintain the facade of holiness. This systemic failure extended beyond the convent itself to the broader church hierarchy. Bishop Alessandro Ruggiero, who had oversight responsibility for Santa Chiara, was found to have received multiple reports of suspicious deaths and unusual behavior at the convent. His response had been to order the reports buried and to threaten the messengers with excommunication if they persisted in their accusations. His concern was not for the welfare of the nuns under his care, but for the reputation of the Church and his own position within it. The ripple effects of the scandal reached the highest levels of the Catholic Church. Pope Sixtus IV, already struggling with the challenges of the Renaissance, and the growing Protestant movement, was forced to confront the reality that the institutional structures he led were capable of harboring and protecting the most heinous criminals. The case of Sister Margarita de Palermo became a catalyst for the most significant reforms in monastic life since the founding of the religious orders. New regulations were implemented requiring regular inspections of convents by external authorities, mandatory reporting of deaths and disappearances, and the establishment of channels through which nuns could report concerns without fear of retaliation. The isolation that had allowed Sister Margarita's crimes to continue was replaced by a system of accountability that made such horrors much more difficult to conceal. But the reforms came too late for the victims whose lives had been lost to Sister Margarita's madness. The 23 nuns who had died under her care were commemorated in a special memorial service, their names inscribed in a book of remembrance that would be kept in the Cathedral of Palermo. The 3 children who had been murdered were buried with full honors, their graves marked with stones that proclaimed them martyrs to the evil that had masqueraded as holiness. The surviving nuns who had been members of Sister Margarita's inner circle faced a difficult process of rehabilitation and reintegration. Many never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of their experiences, struggling with guilt, shame, and the knowledge that they had participated in acts that violated every principle they had once held sacred. Some spent the rest of their lives in penitential silence, unable to speak of what they had witnessed and done. Sister Agnese, the whistleblower whose courage had brought the conspiracy to light, was granted a special papal dispensation that allowed her to leave religious life and return to secular society. She married a merchant from Naples and lived quietly, never speaking publicly about her experiences but carrying the weight of her memories until her death in 1502. Her grave bears a simple inscription: "She chose truth over silence," a testament to the courage it had taken to break the conspiracy of evil. The case of Sister Margarita de Palermo also had a profound impact on the development of criminal investigation techniques. The methods used to uncover and document her crimes represented some of the earliest applications of what would later be recognized as forensic science. The careful examination of the victim's remains, the analysis of the physical evidence found in the convent, and the systematic documentation of witness testimony created a new standard for criminal prosecutions. Dr. Giuseppe Ruggeri, the physician whose suspicions had first drawn attention to the suspicious deaths at the convent, was later commissioned by the Vatican to develop new protocols for investigating unusual deaths in religious communities. His work laid the foundation for the modern understanding of serial killer behavior and the importance of pattern recognition in criminal investigations. The theological implications of Sister Margarita's case continued to reverberate through the Church for generations. Her perversion of the doctrine of communion, her claim that literal cannibalism was a form of spiritual practice, challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious experience and the possibility of divine revelation. Theologians were forced to develop new criteria for distinguishing between genuine mystical experiences and pathological delusions. The case also contributed to the growing debate about the nature of evil itself. Was Sister Margarita's behavior the result of demonic possession, as some claimed, or was it a purely human phenomenon that could be explained through psychological and social factors? The Church's ultimate conclusion that her actions were the result of human choice rather than supernatural influence represented a significant shift in thinking about the nature of moral responsibility. The story of the Cannibal Nun of Palermo spread far beyond the borders of Sicily, becoming a cautionary tale that was told throughout Europe and beyond. It inspired countless works of literature, art, and music that explored themes of religious corruption, the abuse of authority, and the thin line between devotion and madness. The figure of Sister Margarita became an archetypal representation of the dangers of religious extremism and the need for vigilance against the corruption of power. In the Protestant regions of Europe, the story was used as propaganda against the Catholic Church, evidence of the inherent corruption of monasticism and the dangers of celibacy. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin cited the case as proof that the Catholic system was fundamentally flawed and that only a return to scriptural authority could prevent such horrors from recurring. The Catholic Church's response was to use the case as an argument for reform rather than abandonment of monastic life. The horrors of Santa Chiara were portrayed as an aberration, a result of inadequate oversight and insufficient accountability that had been corrected through the new regulations and inspection procedures. The Church argued that the system had worked in the end, that the evil had been exposed and punished, and that the lessons learned would prevent similar tragedies in the future. But the damage to the Church's reputation was lasting. The revelation that such horrors could occur within the walls of a convent, that religious authority could be used to facilitate rather than prevent evil, shattered many people's faith in the institutional Church. The case contributed to the growing secularization of European society and the rise of individual conscience as a check on religious authority. The story of Sister Margarita de Palermo also had a profound impact on the development of women's rights within the Church. The case highlighted the vulnerability of women in religious life, the ways in which the monastic system could be used to exploit and abuse those who were supposed to be protected. It led to new regulations governing the treatment of nuns and the establishment of more robust mechanisms for addressing complaints and concerns. The psychological insights gained from studying Sister Margarita's case also contributed to the development of modern understanding of mental illness and criminal behavior. Her combination of religious delusions, cannibalistic compulsions, and charismatic leadership became a template for understanding how individual psychopathology could infect entire communities. The case was studied by early psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to understand the relationship between religious experience and mental illness. The forensic evidence from the case also provided important insights into the nature of cannibalistic behavior. The careful documentation of Sister Margarita's methods, her techniques for keeping victims alive while consuming their flesh, and the psychological factors that drove her escalating violence contributed to the development of modern criminal profiling techniques. Her case became a prototype for understanding the psychology of serial killers and the ways in which seemingly normal individuals could be transformed into monsters. The legacy of Sister Margarita da Palermo extends far beyond the boundaries of her own time and place. Her story serves as a permanent reminder of the human capacity for evil and the need for constant vigilance against the corruption of power. It demonstrates the importance of transparency and accountability in all institutions, but particularly in those that claim moral authority over others. The case also illustrates the power of individual conscience and courage in the face of institutional evil. Sister Agnes's decision to break her silence and reveal the truth, despite the personal cost, ultimately saved lives and brought justice to the victims. Her example reminds us that even those who have been complicit in evil can find the strength to do what is right, that redemption is possible even for those who have fallen into the deepest darkness. The story of the Cannibal Nun of Palermo continues to be told today, not as entertainment or sensationalism, but as a necessary reminder of the lessons of history. It serves as a warning against the dangers of unquestioned authority, of communities that value reputation over truth, of individuals who convince themselves that they are above the moral laws that govern the rest of humanity. In our modern world, where institutional scandals continue to shock and horrify, the case of Sister Margarita da Palermo remains tragically relevant. It reminds us that the capacity for evil exists in all human hearts, that the difference between protector and predator can be as thin as the line between devotion and obsession. It warns us about the dangers of isolation, extremism, and unchecked power, and it calls us to remain vigilant against the corruption that can infect even the most sacred institutions. The bells of Palermo still ring out across the ancient city, calling the faithful to prayer, just as they did in Sister Margarita's time. But they ring now over a community that has learned to be more vigilant, more questioning, more aware of the potential for evil that exists even in the most holy places. The story of the Cannibal Nun serves as their eternal reminder that the price of goodness is eternal vigilance, that the light of truth must always be ready to pierce the darkness of deception, and that the courage to speak truth to power is the most sacred duty of all. The physical evidence of Sister Margarita's crimes has long since been destroyed, the bones buried, the documents sealed away in Vatican archives that few will ever see. But the memory persists, preserved in the collective consciousness of a community that witnessed the unthinkable and learned from it. The story continues to be told not because we admire the monster, but because we need to remember the lessons she taught us about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most sacred institutions. In the end, Sister Margarita da Palermo achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind she had sought. She is remembered not as a saint or a mystic, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the pursuit of holiness becomes corrupted by pride, madness, and the fundamental human capacity for evil. Her story serves as a permanent warning against the dangers of religious extremism and the need for constant vigilance against the corruption of power. The convent of Santa Chiara is gone, its stones scattered to the winds, and its memory deliberately erased by those who wanted to forget. But the story refuses to die, passed down through generations like a virus that infects the collective memory of a community that witnessed the unthinkable. It serves as a reminder that some stories are too important to forget, that some lessons are too valuable to ignore, and that the price of forgetting the past is to be condemned to repeat it. And so, the tale of Sister Margarita da Palermo, the Cannibal Nun of Palermo, continues to be told, not as a ghost story or a work of fiction, but as a stark reminder of the human capacity for both evil and redemption. It reminds us that the darkness is always there, waiting for the light to fail, and that our only defense against it is the courage to speak truth to power, to choose conscience over convenience, and to remember that the most sacred duty of all is to protect the innocent from those who would harm them. The story ends where it began, in the cobblestone streets of Palermo, where the Mediterranean sun still beats down on weathered stone walls and the scent of salt air still mingles with the perfume of orange blossoms. But now there is something else in the air, something that wasn't there before Sister Margarita's reign of terror. There is the knowledge that evil can wear the mask of holiness, that monsters can hide in plain sight, and that the only protection against such horrors is the courage to question, to investigate, and to act when conscience demands it. The bells still ring, calling the faithful to prayer, but they ring now with a different meaning. They serve not just as a call to worship, but as a reminder to remain vigilant, to question authority, and to never forget the lessons of the past. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy would not be the horror that occurred within the walls of Santa Chiara, but the failure to learn from it, the decision to forget the lessons written in blood and preserved in memory for all those who have the courage to remember.